So Resident Evil 1, the first port was on the PS1. Now to start, there's a US port, Resident Evil, and Biohazard, the Japan port. So let's start with the differences. On the US port, it was harder and easier depending on certain areas. Like, the US port had no auto-aim, which is kind of hard on console. But, I totally don't need auto-aim. And we all know ink ribbons. In Japan, you got them in packs of 2, but unlike no auto-aim, they felt bad, so they gave the US port packs of 3. But then, they also didn't feel bad again because they gave the zombies more health in the US, so you die more. But now, let's get into the cutscenes and gameplay. So in Japan, it's a lot more bloody, and the most known change is when a zombie eats someone's head. But in the US ports, that scene is altered and in some ports even removed. But now, let's look at some different ports that were changed. Unlike the PS1, another console that got it was the Sega Saturn, which did have auto-aim, and it had its own custom battle mode where you fight zombies in waves. Now sure, the graphics were slightly worse than the PS1, but it also had new enemies that the PS1 did not have, called ticks, a hunter type. Now, before we get to the PC port, we got one more. The DS got a port. I don't know why they needed to do that, but it had auto-aim plus door skipping, where you can, skip the door animation. That takes way too long. But it was a really pixelized resolution because, it's the DS. And also the bottom screen, they changed the puzzles so that you could have interacting with the bottom touchscreen where, you can't really have a touchscreen on your TV on the PS1. Then the PC port that has auto-aim, door skipping, and can go to 480p for the original port. Now to the next version of Resident Evil, the Director's Cut. And it changed some stuff like it added more blind spots for the camera area so it was harder. Plus it added back a little bit more blood. Like Japan also changed the mansion a little bit to make it a little more better, plus moved key items. It also added more zombies and a stronger new handgun that was more powerful than any other handgun in the game, plus new outfits and a little change to the soundtrack. And then one of the last ports was the DualShock port, which just made use of the rumble of the new controller for the PS1. And then the other ports, PS3, PS4, and PS5, Xbox, and all that, were not different from the other ports, because they were basically just emulating the PS1 port. But then we can get to the remake ports. So to start, it now made zombies come back to life later in the game if you didn't burn them. Plus, puzzle items changed. They got new and better voice acting, and Lisa Trevor was in the game. Now this was made on the GameCube, but has a weird port. It was on the Wii. And to reload and do a 180, you can shake the Wii controller. But this wasn't even the weirdest Resident Evil Wii game, but more on that later. So that's basically all the main ports for Resident Evil 1 I could find. Don't know if you guys find any better ports or weirder ports. More likely try and find weirder ports, which we will see a lot weirder ports, especially for Resident Evil 4. Those had a lot of weird ports. But we'll get to that later in the video. For now, let's get to the Resident Evil fans considered best game, and that is Resident Evil 2. So to start, the PS1 and then the DualShock, which will be standard. But Resident Evil 2 was also on the Sega Dreamcast, where you can look at your health without having to pause the game, and it's just on the top of the screen. Plus, it shows you your bullet count without pausing, and in Japan, it was called Biohazard 2 Valve Plus, where you could listen to Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2, plus the Code Veronica demo soundtrack. Plus, it had a mini demo for the Code Veronica game and a gallery mode where you can look at character 3D models. Plus, it was coded from the PC port, so it was higher resolution. But on to the next Nintendo port, which, it seems like it was pretty standard for Capcom back in the day. And Resident Evil 2 was ported on the N64, which was specifically ported by Angel Studios, which is now a version of Rockstar. Maybe they might get GTA 6 out one day. But back to Resident Evil 2. So, it was quite a challenge to fit the entire game on the N64. So they needed to lower the graphics, have lower audio files, plus less high resolution backgrounds, but more files for like lore reasons for Resident Evil 3 and some of Resident Evil 0. Plus, because it was Nintendo, they made the blood blue or green and less graphic gameplay. Now, it might sound bad, but it didn't have that many tank controls and had a randomizer mode, so it is still considered one of the best Resident Evil 2 ports in people's eyes. And also, it was on the GameCube. Now, one thing is that it was in a better 480p with better character models, being one of the newer ports for the old Resident Evil 2, where it had a battle mode, and for the new gamers, a super easy mode that starts you with a minigun. And it had one of the biggest things in gaming history. You can now skip the cutscenes. And not as big, but Resident Evil 2 had different voice actors for this file and higher audio sound, making it better. And if you want to go back to Resident Evil 2 but trying to avoid the as bad tank controls and bad gameplay for today's standard, you should go with the GameCube. So that's all the big consoles for Resident Evil 2. So let's go to the handheld ports, being on PSP. Basically just a PS1 port on a handheld, and now to the remake. A lot has changed, a lot more than the Resident Evil 1 remake especially. You know, new story changes with PS5, Xbox, and PC port. And the Switch, where I made a video about it. But, you know, you have to stream it, it's buggy, and it's all over the place, and overall just sucks. But now, the weird ports. On new phones and iPads where you can use a controller, but if you don't have a controller, you can use a bad thumbstick like Minecraft on phones. And with how small phones are to monitor, the UI felt small, and overall people think it was just rushed and not done well overall. So Resident Evil 2 and the Resident Evil 2 remake has many ports, some good and others bad. Well, you know, the Switch one's dog, but on to the next mainline game, and you all know Stars. So here's all the ports of Resident Evil 3, because for some reason the old voice only says Resident Evil in the video I found it in. But we got all the normal ports, PS1, PC port, but a more weird port for Resident Evil 3 was the Dreamcast, but it was still better than the PS1 port power-wise. It ran 480p and had cleaner character models. Plus, like some of the Resident Evil 2 ports, this let you play the bonus games from the start, letting you skip the story if you want to for some reason. Plus some new skins, just for the Dreamcast. So if you had this, it was a good port for Resident Evil 3. Like Resident Evil 2, you could see your health without going to a pause menu. And now to the GameCube, where this also had cleaner graphics for the newer console, but you could also make it brighter if you're in a super dark room or something. Plus the controller helped the tank controls feel better. But let's also see the differences between the US and Japan. So to start, in the US, it's called Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, but in Japan it's called Biohazard 3 Last Escape. But then the gameplay. In Japan, the zombies and all other enemies had less health than the USA ports. Plus, if you only played the remake, you may not know that you can fight Nemesis more, and in the USA, he had about 100 more HP than in Japan for the mini-slaps optional fights. Also in the USA, Jill takes about 10% more damage per hit. Like, guys, what did we do to piss off Japan? And Japan also got more ammo drops, but unlike Resident Evil 1, Japan had less score, and the US got more. And so the US port was harder, but now it's one of the most hated remakes, the Resident Evil 3 remake. They got rid of the choose your own adventure part, but it was basically the same port on the PS4, 5, Xbox, PC. Switch was bad because you had to stream it, but the weirdest remake port was it could be streamed on this thing called Amazon Luna, which is fine, no new problems other than different streaming games, you know. Except for one tiny thing. You have to account for input lag more. For the Perfect Dodge especially, which was one of the main selling ports of Resident Evil 3. So the Perfect Dodge you have to account for, like, you know, as I said, delay. And this makes it really hard when you go on the harder difficulties than the lower difficulties. So overall, Resident Evil 3 had basically the same ports across a lot of consoles, but onto one of the most port-friendly, I guess we should say, games, which is Resident Evil 4. To start with the most known port, the GameCube port. So let's talk about it. The GameCube could load the cutscenes in real time, so you could have different skins for whatever cutscene, and more in-depth VFX. And unlike other ports, the audio was higher quality. And one of the biggest things was the chainsaw controller. Most of you most likely know what this is, but one thing about Resident Evil 4 on the GameCube was that it did not have the DLC with Ada, aka Separate Ways, unlike the other ports. But still, overall, it looked better for the first ports, but it was also harder than the other ports. Like, the knife did less damage, the AI was a lot more aggressive, and could attack you a lot more. And lastly, money dropped less. But most likely, the port that you have played, if you did play the original Resident Evil 4, was the PS2 port, considering it was the most sold port of Resident Evil 4. So yeah. To start, the PS2 got Separate Ways, which was about 5 hours, which fixed some of the plot holes. You got new guns for Ada, but also a new gun for Leon, where if you beat the hardest game mode, you got it, and it could kill enemies and bosses in one shot. And like the other ports, the PS2 got skins that the GameCube did not. Plus, you could rewatch the cutscenes, and you had, from some of the older ports, a character model gallery, like in Resident Evil 1. Now, with the PS2, it wasn't as good looking, but a lot of the ports were based off the PS2 because it was considered the least glitchy. But one of the fun weird ports was the Wii. I mean, it was good, it had the GameCube look, and it was the first port for more widescreen TVs. But then the weird thing, to shoot you use the Wii controller, and to use a knife you shake the remote. Plus, QuickTime events were now motion-based. And when I say you have to use the Wii controller, I mean you had to point it at the screen, and it was in a first point. It was not first person, but you did have to manually aim at the screen, unlike a joystick, like with the nunchuck. Anyway, back to old me. First person angle. So if you got good at aiming, it was faster, so it could be easier, but you also had to get used to the controls that none of the other games used. It also did get the new gun on the PS2, and it was even more powerful than the PS2. It got Separate Ways, and all of this made it so the Wii was an easier port, but then onto the newer ports of Resident Evil 4, like the PS3 was now made so you could play it HD, the PS4 HD 60 frames, plus the Switch can actually run Resident Evil 4 without streaming, making it a better Resident Evil port. And then a brand new PC port that was a lot better and is more well looked at. But back to the weird ports. This game was ran on some phones that had low graphics and touch controls, like the RE2 remake, except before this. And this basically stripped the game of its entire story. It was more like Mercenaries mode, where you just went around killing a bunch of enemies. And it was eventually taken off the store in like about 2015. But then the MetaQuest 2 got a VR port, which was really cool and well looked at. And it did change some dialogues from the 2000s, but other than that, it's basically the same port, but like the Wii, but you know, with the MetaQuest. And now for the weirdest port, Zeebo. Now, this was not a well-sold console, and unlike all other consoles, every single console that ran this port, this console ran the mobile port, because it was so bad that it had to run the mobile port. And that was basically all the original Resident Evil 4 ports. The remake, you know, just all the modern consoles, nothing really different. But now, on to one of your guys' favorite games, totally, which is Resident Evil 5. So to start, it was on PS3, where you had to buy the DLC, and after that, it was also on the Xbox 360, which was ported to the PC port, which is considered still pretty good, and it had its own Mercenaries mode, where you didn't have to pay for it. But now let's look at Resident Evil 5 in the US versus Japan. So to start, the US had more gore than Japan yet again, and Japan also had a lot more, the camera cuts away from the death or gore. But then to the only, like, unique, but also super weird RE5 port is a TV. Yeah, Resident Evil 5 was ported to the NVIDIA Shield Android TV that was ported by NVIDIA Lightspeed. Now, this was a very unstable port, and worse, it was only at 720p, where the others were full HD/1080p. Plus, if you were lucky, you got 30 frames. But it was not stable. It did have the DLCs though, but no co-op, which was one of the main selling points for Capcom at the time. Plus, at the time it was ported, it was a lot closer to the 2009 port than the modern 2015 ports, and yeah, you can no longer buy this port because it was not very liked. But Resident Evil 5 also got a phone port, but it was basically just the Mercenaries mode because phones at the time couldn't handle Resident Evil 5. But I know so many fans were super angry that, like Resident Evil 4, it didn't come to Zeebo because it was so weak it couldn't handle Resident Evil 5. So that leads us to the end of the video. But before that, did you know that the longest port that was changed was the Resident Evil 1 remake that added about 6 hours of story? Well, thank you for watching this far. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you guys want me to make a part 2 for more of the spin-off / not as mainline Resident Evil games, or the newer ones, which I probably won't do that many of, because the newer you get, the less ports there are that are different. But, yeah. If you guys want me to make more longer videos like this compared to my average 5 minutes, make sure to let me know, and I will try to make my videos longer for you guys. I can't guarantee a consistent upload schedule if I start making them longer, but yeah. This video, as you can tell, is a lot longer, specifically 2,000 words longer than my average video. But I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next video, and have a good day.